Okay, well, today is Thursday, what is it, April 22nd. It's Earth Day. Thank you, Larry, for bringing the Earth uh, to it. And this is our weekly office hours for waste site cleanup. This is like episode 48, I think. So we're getting to our big anniversary issue. Um, and given the expectations that I apparently drummed up for the Earth Day announcements, I'll say right now that we have no plans to do anything special for the 50th edition of it. Um, I just noticed because I had to renumber one of them this morning. It is Earth Day, and the last couple of weeks I've been mentioning that DEP will be doing all sorts of things for Earth Day, and apparently, we probably still are, but none of them are involving waste site cleanup. So I stopped paying attention to them. Um, we were on the list for announcing our Oil Spill Act grants, and those will come very soon. Uh, and hopefully the fact that they were in contention for an Earth Day event, which would have been either at the very scenic Mass Maritime location where we had put in a flow meter a year or so ago, or some other location. It would have been great, but we were passed over in preference for other announcements that involve more money, and thus are far more exciting, or events that involved more directly actions being taken in environmental justice communities. So, I mean, they are really cool, and particularly the EJ work and kind of what we're doing there. I'm not going to say any details because I wouldn't want to steal anybody's thunder, but it's really cool, and it's not the least of which because it involves the color purple. Uh, so hey, look at the press releases, see what happens. But yeah, wayside cleanup got passed over for the sexy big time Earth Day events. We just keep on plodding along, doing what we do, under the radar, without a lot of fanfare, but making life go on, cleaning up the environment one site at a time, and encouraging development, redevelopment, and all of those good things, protecting public health. We are making progress on the tag grants as well. Put in a plug again for next week, uh, a week from today at 7 o'clock at night. We're having uh, a public meeting to talk about the availability of the technical assistance grants, and we do encourage people to kind of tune in for that. Kind of learn about the application process because it is we're giving people money. It's far more complicated than most community groups are used to. So it involves the combis system, where the way that we purchase things and give out money, and that's complicated. So it is important to have either tune in live and be able to ask questions, or it will be recorded and made available. So if you're working with the community or you're representing the community that might be interested in one of these grants, um, be sure one way or another to kind of follow up on that, and we'll lay out kind of how the process works and what the expectations are. So that will be that's next Thursday. Um, the I have one thing I want to kind of pick your brains about, um, getting advice from you guys. But before we do that, anybody have any news, things of interest, questions that you have? No. Okay, well, I'll jump into the question that I have, which came up again as Liz and I were working through some of the response to comments on the MCP revisions, kind of one of the last things. And the question is, why is everybody so afraid of containerized waste? it seems like in some of the comments that we got, that people want to avoid having containerized waste or having things identified as containerized waste. And I feel like I'm missing something about that. And maybe it's just some of the comments that we get. And so I wanted to kind of put this out there for you to help us figure out, are we missing something? Or is there an issue there that is causing concern? And the way it came up in these in the comments had to do mostly with we had made a slight change in the containerized waste definition, trying to make it clearer that remediation waste, when you put it into a container, does not automatically make it containerized waste.
All right.
It wasn't a big policy thing, but in the comments that got back, we got some questions and requests for clarifications on what is and what is not containerized waste, and kind of what we read into it, concern that people would like things to be defined out of containerized waste, if at all possible. And so I'll open it up to you. Can you help?
So Paul, refresh my memory. Containerized waste would be the sand backfill inside an old tank.
Well, funny.
Right?
So funny
and
you should bring that up.
There's a Q&A on that, and if the tank was cleaned out properly, it could be considered remediation waste. But if there was sludge in the bottom, it would be containerized waste. And as I understand that, that would be considered a recyclable waste oil. You transport it under a manifest. I forget it's MA01 or MA99. But that's the difference with containerized waste. It's not remediation waste. You have to handle it differently.
I have to handle it differently, but it's funny you should mention that, because in looking back at kind of what we have written in the past about containerized waste, that's pretty much it. That one Q&A and it's one example of that, and half that, and I think that's maybe where some of the kind of concern or questions come up, is in rereading that Q&A, it's actually answering two questions or dealing with two issues. One is this waste containerized or not? And then it's also dealing with another issue of, is this waste, whether or not it's containerized, a hazardous waste or not? So what you were kind of went into that example, and was specific to that example, was kind of essentially waste oil at the bottom of this tank that was mixed with the sand that was in there. And because waste oil is a hazardous waste, a Massachusetts hazardous waste, then the management of that waste oil, whether it's containerized or not, has to take into account that it's a hazardous waste. And I was wondering, when I went back and read that, whether that Q&A kind of implied, and it shouldn't have, and I'm not sure kind of in reading it now myself, I'm too deep into it, whether it gives the implication that containerized waste is always considered hazardous waste. I think it comes up a lot in the context of dealing with hazardous waste. But is it clear to everybody that you can have containerized hazardous waste and containerized non-hazardous waste? And those are two separate issues, whether it's hazardous or not, or whether it's containerized or not. And that being containerized doesn't automatically make it hazardous waste. That's a completely separate issue.
Well, let me pull out my second generation 2009 training, which was one of the few manuals I did bring home with me.
So that was not left. You could have added that to your collection on the folders.
No, that wasn't in the picture, because it was at home. But the 1995 version was in the picture. So.
Yeah. So while you're looking at that up, Elliot, the context in which this came up was, and I almost hate bringing up the example, granulated activated carbon.
Yes.
And we had two commenters asking, could you please clarify whether spent GAC is containerized waste or not? And so my question to you would be, why do you care? And I ask that because I think whether it's containerized or not is not the real issue, and that the underlying issue, like the Q&A, is if you're treating water for something that may or may not be a hazardous waste. So if it's PERC that's coming from a source that is a listed hazardous waste, then what you're accumulating is a hazardous waste. So whether it's containerized or not, that material, absent a contained in determination, would have to be managed as a hazardous waste. But if there's no smoking gun, if it's PERC from some other source and it's not a listed hazardous waste, that source is not a listed waste, then what you're accumulating in the carbon is not a hazardous waste. So the carbon is not a hazardous waste. So if it's containerized waste, it's containerized non-hazardous waste, which is basically solid waste. Because it's not remediation waste, it then becomes solid waste.
Paul, I think you might be onto something, but if you just take a moment and Google MassDEP containerized waste, look at what comes up.
It's a picture of who, Paul?
No, I'm just saying.
MassDEP
Containerized
waste. MassDEP hazardous waste management, mass.gov.
Hazardous waste regulations, mass.gov. MassDEP hazardous waste management guidance during Connecticut, for some reason. Hazardous waste management during COVID-19.
Yeah, well,
you put in containerized waste, you get hazardous waste is what comes back.
Yeah, and so I mean that really is my point, that is there, because a lot of what's out there, whether it's our Q&A, our one Q&A, or you Google it and the first thing that comes up are containerized waste in the context of hazardous waste, because containerized waste is listed quite in the hazardous waste regulations as long as the container contains hazardous waste. Again, the real question there is what is inside hazardous or not? The fact that it's containerized doesn't make it hazardous waste. It partly dictates how you can manage the hazardous waste. And for our purposes, if you have containerized hazardous waste, then you can't treat it or manage it on site without a license. But if that hazardous waste is already in a container, then the most likely thing is that you're going to ship it off site for management, for treatment or disposal. You're not going to open the container and treat it on site at that point.
I recall years ago we were doing a remediation on a chlorinated solvent site. It was 111 TCA, and it was a dual phase extraction, and we had these giant vapor phase GACs. They were like 1,000 pounds. And there was a company that would, and so the GAC would have had hazardous waste adsorbed to it, and a company would come pick up the container, wouldn't empty it. It would take it away to their facility, recycle it there, and bring us a fresh one. So I would imagine that company would have. It was a carbon supply, company. But I would imagine that, as I recall, that went off under a manifest.
Right, and that company would have had a license to treat the
Yeah.
hazardous waste and recycled carbon,
Right.
which is the way it should work. Yeah, so that I think that would be straightforward.
So getting back to the oil example, so waste oil is not considered hazardous in Massachusetts, correct?
Waste
With
oil
the
is
smoking-
it is a waste oil is a hazardous waste. It's an MAO1 hazardous waste, Massachusetts. It is not a federal hazardous waste. So we carve out a more complex kind of ways of dealing with it, but it is a state listed hazardous waste.
As I recall back when they developed the smoking gun policy, right? Because that's when any oil was hazardous. And then they had this, you came up with the smoking gun policy that you didn't have an identified source. And I thought that carved out oil. I remember now, this was back in the days when DEP had to sign the bills of lading. You had to prove, right, that it wasn't a waste oil in order to manage it. And then they came up with the policy. So waste oil is hazardous, but just oil in itself is not, right?
Right. So there would be a difference between, say, waste oil, which is oil that is discarded, versus virgin product that it would be kind of in an underground storage tank at a gas station that leaked. So there you have virgin product that leaked and got into the environment. That's different from waste oil. So part of it, like any hazardous waste, and particularly listed hazardous waste, is trying to figure out, based on environmental analytical results that just show target compounds and petroleum fractions, that doesn't tell you what the source was, and the source is important for that determination of whether it's hazardous waste or not, because of the hazardous waste rules, not the waste and cleanup rules, by the way. So that's where knowing what the source is and having to have information about the source in order to identify and determine whether it's hazardous waste or not and what rules apply or not is important. But the fact that I'm trying to get at the containerized, non-containerized question.
So if you find it at the bottom of a storage tank, it's waste product, right?
Well, that was the issue.
That's the easy.
We'll go back and forth on, Elliot, is, it's waste if it's on the outside of the USD, but if it's still in the USD, is it waste? But because the argument I've always thought was reasonable and have used, and is that, you take the oil out, but the sludge at the bottom is not the oil, right? It's
right.
It's a waste product, and therefore then it becomes it's waste oil, and therefore it's
right.
MA1.
Right, and in that example that Elliot read from the Q&A, the specific example was a tank that was abandoned in place with residual material at the bottom, and they filled it with sand. So so even if that material at time zero was still virgin product, when you pour sand into it and you abandon it, that is now waste material. And so that if you then go ahead and dig it up and have to manage that, you now have to manage that as a waste material. So getting back to my original question, I think you are kind of helping me understand, and we want to provide more clarity on the questions that came up, particularly with the GAC and all that. But I am very concerned. I don't want to I want to make sure that I understand it and what the issues are completely before we go off and write something silly.
Actually, the training does have graphics, there's one graphic. It says waste management oversimplified. Is it a hazardous waste? Yes or no? So yes, manage it as a hazardous waste under RCRA. No. Has it been released to the environment? No. Manage it as a solid waste. And it's yes, manage it as remediation waste.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
then,
Something tells me that if the graphic was labeled hazardous waste management oversimplified, that I probably did that one.
then the next one has more arrows and
So perhaps,
possible routes.
so in the 2 paragraphs in the Q&A, perhaps the sentence at the end of the last paragraph is one that, containerized waste that is classified as a hazardous waste must be managed in accordance with the hazardous waste regs when removed from the tank, not remediation waste regs, since the definition of remediation waste specifically excludes containerized waste. So
Yes.
if the people are concerned about stuff being defined as containerized waste, that they're trying to manage it as remediation waste, then they can't if it's containerized waste.
Yeah, what I suspect is that for most of our work, people divide the world up into remediation waste and hazardous waste. And if it very clearly says it's not remediation waste, then the fear is, oh, now I have to manage this as hazardous waste. And I think what we need to clarify is that there is a third option. It might actually be solid waste.
Yeah, and the first sentence of the next paragraph, it's not classified as hazardous waste. It's considered to be solid waste and can be managed under COM 97001 and WSC 94400.
Yeah.
What would be an example of it being solid waste?
But
If waste oil is hazardous, what would be an example?
Well, Elliot, you're focusing just on the oil.
No, I'm saying, so what else? We've talked about oil. What else would be a solid waste?
I have a question along that line. So if you're using GAC canisters to treat PFAS groundwater and PFAS is not a hazardous waste, do the GAC canisters get managed as solid waste?
Yeah.
With PFAS in the GAC?
I think that would be the implication.
So there's another
Cool.
graphic.
So
3 examples of containerized waste. Example 2. So it shows a GAC carbon canister, spent process waste of TCE, and then shows an buried underground tank, OHM, and releases OHM that are not environment. So that includes a GAC carbon canister as containerized waste. So depending on what's in the GAC would depend on whether or not it was hazardous, right?
Yep. Yep.
So if I can just add one note to what Marilyn asked, is that there's going to be a whole lot of houses with POET systems that are going to have carbon treatment for PFAS. We're going to pull that carbon out, knowing that it is spent with PFAS. And if we call it solid waste, the landfill is going to have testing requirements that says, we want to accept solid waste, but we're not going to accept solid waste that includes PFAS. There's going to be a crossing of the streams, I believe.
Yeah, and that might be true. And the requirement will still be, if you're shipping waste off somewhere, it has to go to some place that can take it and will take it. So the limitations on where it goes may not be driven by DEP's classification of it. But in the case of, put PFAS aside for a second, because that's that obviously will strike a nerve at landfills if it doesn't already. Pick any other contaminant. If you're using it to treat benzene in water or something, then can you ship that off to a landfill as solid waste? And the implication is, as long as the benzene is not a listed hazardous waste, then it's not a hazardous waste, it's not remediation waste, it's a solid waste.
So
Paul, this is Paul. There are times where, there might be a chlorinated solvent that would be a listed characteristic waste, and then we run some leachability tests on it to demonstrate that it's not a characteristic waste, meaning that it's not leachable, doesn't exhibit those properties, and we haven't identified a source. And oftentimes, we work with the disposing facility, and it gets shipped off as a non-hazardous waste. And as you know, there's the contained in determination policy that if we have stuff less than RCS1, we don't have a source, although we have a listed waste, it can go off as non-hazardous. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I fully agree with that policy.
Sure, okay.
Is that I helped write that policy. I'm very much for it. The one issue I would have, Cole, with kind of how you describe that is the way of phrasing it, that it's a listed hazardous waste, but we don't have a source. And I disagree. I think that's an
Yeah.
incorrect statement,
That's an inconsistency.
because the whether or not it is a listed hazardous waste depends upon knowledge of the source. That the default in the hazardous waste program is not that all TCE is or all PCE, or something that it is all hazardous waste. It is those materials from particular kinds of processes and sources. And that if you have that material and you don't know what the source was, then the default is not that it's automatically a hazardous waste. You have to know the source for that.
And that would have to be characteristic only, right?
Well, no, that's for listed hazardous waste. If it's characteristic, it's characteristic.
Right.
But the trick of, if it's characteristic.
What I'm saying is, you might not be able to establish that it's listed by not knowing the source, but it might still be characteristic.
Right. It might still be characteristic, but what we're dealing with a lot at our sites, maybe certainly there's some leachability issues, and if it's leachable, then you end up with a characteristic waste. But then you do have the option of treating it on site so it's no longer leachable, and then it's no longer a hazardous waste, and you can manage it as remediation waste. But the contained in policy deals with the listed hazardous waste, and there the source is very not only important, it's determinative. It doesn't matter, the material, what the chemical is and what the concentration is, doesn't matter. What matters is where did it come from? What was the source? And that makes it the listed hazardous waste or not a listed hazardous waste. And you could have TC in PC, I know, because I know the PCE S1 standard is 1 part per billion, right? One part per, it's 1, whatever it is. And you could have soil that is exactly the same thing, PCE at a certain at 5 parts per whatever, and in one case it will be a hazardous waste because it came from a listed source, and the exact same type of material at the exact same concentrations would not be a hazardous waste because it did not come from a listed source. But the stuff that we're dealing with, PCE in soil at a certain concentration, it looks exactly the same. And which is why we created the contained in policy, which is based on contained in regulations in the hazardous waste program, to make it easier to manage soil with low levels of these materials, regardless of what the source was.
Yeah, we're actually dealing with a site that's been agglomerated among several parcels, and one of them we had low concentrations, as you're saying, of PCE, TCE, and it is on a source property, so it's listed. On the far side, where it's another parcel, another ownership, total separate environmental history, we have similar concentrations, but it's not going to be listed because we don't know, there isn't a source.
Yeah.
It just seems like it's kind of ridiculous, especially in the first case where it was trace levels of these chlorinateds, very low levels, but it's got to be a listed waste.
Yes, and I'll put in a plug for the contained in determination process at this point, specifically for that, Joel, where you can submit the petitions online. There's I think a 21-day presumptive approval process. We do have somebody who looks at them and often lets them go presumptive approval or works with people to have them approved. But recognizing that trace levels of these materials that are hazardous waste because the the hazardous waste rules are written to discourage dilution as a way of managing hazardous waste.
Yes.
But that there are, given that we're coming at it from a different direction, from finding things in the environment and cleaning it up, that kind of having a way of kind of fairly easily exempting it or determining that it is no longer a hazardous waste and can be managed as remediation waste is in everybody's best interest. So, and that was a policy EPA signed on as well, because as you certainly recognize, DEP's hazardous waste program for the most part implements the federal hazardous waste program. So we have to make sure that all of the rules from the EPA level down to the state and then across programs at state kind of work as harmoniously as possible. And
Including corrective action management units?
CAMU.
yes, including CAMUs, one of the better acronyms, I think.
Yeah.
Oh, I thought so too, but I remember being amazed years ago under the MCP at coming into contact with another LSP, and TCE and soils that were clearly from a listed source, and et cetera. And so the answer was, we're going to, vent them on site through carbon until they are no longer characteristic or anything else, and clean them up at the point before they were generated.
Right.
Yeah, there's the whole, try to do things before they're generated. But even, yeah, and I mean, we do have agreements that processes where material can be treated on site as well. It does trigger other record requirements, but I think more or less the two programs are working fairly well together these days. It helps that the corrective action program is being implemented through 21E now. So everybody agrees that kind of the targets, the rules, the processes generally follow the MCP with a couple additional things that are, in the grand scheme of things, relatively minor.
Paul, could I go back to your example of the GAC that was treating benzene and was not hazardous, didn't fail TCLP as a characteristic waste? So as I understand the reasoning, that would now be a solid waste. How do you manage that? Does solid waste not under COM 97? What would be the proper management process for a GAC of spent carbon that wasn't hazardous?
It's spent carbon that wasn't hazardous, so it's not from a listed source, and it doesn't trigger something else, leachability probably being the biggest one. Then it could probably, if a landfill will take it, it would probably go to a landfill, or it could be
under 9701, right?
That could go under COM 97.
Well, I mean, the problem with COM 97 is that it is specific to soil, right? So the problem is not that was containerized material. It's more that it's not soil. It's not contaminated soil. So what do you do with other contaminated material that is not soil? You pay for its disposal.
So it'll probably go to a carbon recycling facility under a non-DEP bill of lading, I imagine.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it could go under a bill of lading because that would be managing it up, providing more managing solid, there's no rule against managing solid waste, the transport under a bill of lading, because that would be a higher level of scrutiny, one might say. Just like you could always manage remediation waste using a hazardous waste manifest. Why would you? I don't know, but you could.
Okay. I'll put my notebook away.
Okay, so it doesn't seem like I'm missing anything more than the usual, the whole intersection of remediation waste, hazardous waste, solid waste, containerized waste, non-containerized waste. All of that is not as transparent to people that don't deal with it on a daily basis as we would want it to be. So I think it would help if you guys have any kind of suggestions for Q&As that would try to make this more straightforward. But I think the answer to those questions about the GAC is that don't worry so much about whether it's containerized or non-containerized. That doesn't really have a huge, make a huge difference in how you manage it. It really is a question of, is it hazardous or non-hazardous? In fact, you might be in a slightly better situation to have containerized non-hazardous waste than to have uncontainerized non-hazardous waste. The former can be disposed of as solid waste. The latter would be remediation waste. It may all end up in the same place, being managed roughly in the same way, but one would have to be shipped under a bill of lading, the other wouldn't. And if it's hazardous waste, all bets are off. That's what people should be afraid of. Okay, I think you've given me the confidence to move ahead on those questions and those responses, comments. And that should bring us to the end of our discussion today, unless you guys have some other issues. That was helpful.
No,
I appreciate that.
it was a nice discussion. It's always good to discuss gray areas. No, Ken's shaking his head.
Well, it's always good to acknowledge at least that there are gray areas or areas where additional guidance is necessary. And you know, it would be better to have more Q&As about this. So if we have questions that would make good Q&As related to containerized waste or that it did seem when I went to find guidance on this that you know, waste site cleanup has not said a lot about containerized waste, which, as Matthew pointed out, basically leads people then to the hazardous waste universe, which might give them a skewed view of what containerized waste is. So it might be, if only to balance it a little bit, it might be good to have a little bit more guidance on that. So,
I think it would be good to have a clarification, Paul, because I mean, we've had the issue of, you know, a small excavation, you know, do we drum it or do we load it directly into a truck? And the answer being, oh, well, we put it directly in the truck, it's remediation waste and it goes under the, you know, they back it up or something. But if we put it in drums, then it's containerized waste. So I think emphasizing your point that just because you put it in a container doesn't make it containerized.
yeah, and that's certainly in the regs. We are making that clarification for that in the we had proposed it, and that's one of the things that will see the light of day at the end of the process.
That is not always clear to me.
So that will be clearer, but I think also having Q&As about it would be helpful as well. So again, send them in and we'll try to get them out there.
I have a hypothetical question, or looking for some guidance, if I may.
Sure.
So there's a particular site that has an AUL on it for some low levels of pesticides, and at the time it was an RCS1, but the property and land has since been rezoned, so such that RCS2 is now applicable, and the developer is looking to do some additional work in the near future, and all of the data indicates that it's below the RCS2 standards. And I'm just wondering if a RAM plan would be required in that particular scenario.
But there's an AUL on the property?
Yes, and and then I guess one of the contaminants of concern were pesticides, but it was previously determined that it was exempt from reporting. But I'm not that familiar with the AUL. I have to look at it specifically what it asks for. But I was just wondering if your site zoning has changed from RCS1 to RCS2 such that your concentrations all meet the S2 standards. Is that still applicable for requirement for a RAM plan?
Or couldn't you just lift the AUL?
Yeah, you'd have to get rid of the AUL to avoid the RAM plan. Because having the AUL triggers the RAM plan for
Right.
certain quantities.
We assume.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Cole, you're talking about doing work that would fall under the 40.1067 provision?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, so
Cole,
I
you
think,
should-
Paragraph 4. Yeah.
right. I think it starts with that the AUL's in place. So you have to deal with the rules for working in the AUL area.
Okay.
Oh, you should ask me this at work. I could have charged the time.
Well, I mean, it's
And
coming
that's
from,
why
it's
you did
coming,
tell
it's
you.
coming from the other party's attorney. And so I just like to get more outside of a bigger audience such as this to, be selfish a little bit and look for consent.
Liz has spoken.
Well, thank you.
And it's recorded.
Yeah.
I didn't mention any client names or any locations, so I'm good.
Larry, that's a nice background for Earth Day.
I thought it might be. Nice change.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to find one of those before my next call.
Yeah.
So what are last time you said DEP was planning some activities for Earth Day?
Oh, you
What's-
came late, Elliot.
Yeah, you came late. We
What
already,
is
we are.
Uh, big
All right,
deal.
sorry.
I disappointed you all. Well, I mean, there are activities and, I'm not sure they've happened yet. So, but they involve other programs giving away more money.
Oh, those are Earth Day. Okay.
State revolving fund stuff here. They
Right.
they give money in millions where we were giving it in tens of thousands.
I thought there was going to be a big fireworks display.
No, because of
Somewhere.
the chlorate. We gave up. on
Right. Well,
fireworks
you're
display
generating work.
years
Okay.
ago. About 15 years ago now. Gave up on that and haven't seen a lot of perchlorate sites since. Boy. Okay, well, if that's it, we can end it for today. You can go out and spend the rest of the day celebrating the Earth. And I don't know, hopefully it will warm up and the winds will die down.
Yeah. Gonna go all the way up to 47 today.
Mhm.
Ooh.
Thank you all.
Okay, talk to you next week.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Paul.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you, everyone.